Our cyber center for our meeting, joint meeting of, this is actually a triple meeting. Have you heard the joke about the lawyer? He was 25 and the angel of death is knocking on his door. He said, what's going on? He said, it's time up. He said, are you sure? He said, yes, it says here. So he looks, he said, I'm supposed to die when I'm 70. So I said, I looked according to the billable hours. So you're actually, you didn't joke, you didn't laugh, right? Anyway, so here we're triple billing this year. This is our cyber forum meeting, and this is also our research seminar, and this is also our Ottawa, Canada program. And we also welcome and acknowledge our guests from Trimble and Bocconi, and external guests, and friends of Professor Trimble, and we're very happy to host Professor Trimble from UNLV, and she'll tell us more about herself. She's a well-known lecturer and researcher in the field of international IP. So we'll hear from you for about 30 minutes, and then we have two student commentators, Alon and Shai, somewhere here, right? Alon? No? Where's Alon? She's somewhere in the Mediterranean. Okay, very good.
And Michael, no? Second.
And right, Michael, you'll be right out. Right? Yeah, so we have Professor Michael Geist, Canada Chair of Research in the areas of IP and
Internet and e-commerce.
Internet and e-commerce.
We've only been working together 6 years. Right.
Well, hello, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Tal said, my name is Marketa Trimble, and I am from the University of Nevada, the Las Vegas campus, which is the place where we have the only law school in the state of Nevada. As Tal mentioned, my area of expertise is intellectual property law, particularly copyright, patents, and conflict of laws or private international law. I never thought of myself as an internet law or cyber law expert. I had my serious doubts that such an area of law even exists. But I have written quite a number of works, as I found out yesterday when I finished my slides, on geolocation and geoblocking, on the topics I presented many times, and each time I present on geoblocking, I tell myself, okay, this is the last time I'm going to talk about this topic. There's absolutely nothing more to discuss here. And then I get invited again and have to come up with something. So you will be the victims of the last lecture I will give. So what is geoblocking, right? What we are talking about, many of you, I am sure, encountered on the internet one of those messages, right? You want to watch your favorite BBC TV show. You click on play and suddenly you get this type of message. In case of BBC iPlayer only works in the UK. Sorry, it's due to rights issues, whatever rights. And of course, if you are in the UK, click here and we will explain. So I will talk first about some terminology, right? Define geolocation, geoblocking, and also talk about a phenomenon that I describe as the process of territorialization of the internet. I will talk about the differences between mandatory and voluntary geoblocking, and discuss the legality of the practice of geoblocking. Now, I should say at the beginning that my original interest in geoblocking started from the back end, which was the legality of circumvention of geoblocking. So many of you probably know, and if you don't, you will learn this at this lecture, as many other people did from me apparently, that you can actually use VPNs and other tools to violate geoblocking, right, to circumvent geoblocking. So originally, my first piece on geoblocking that was published in 2012 was about the legality or not of the circumvention of geoblocking. But today I will focus on the legality of geoblocking. So geolocation. What is geolocation? Well, it's a mechanism that determines the physical location of an actor, of a person acting on the internet. Geolocation is nothing new. It has been used almost since the very beginnings of the internet. It was used for various purposes, such as advertising and also security. And of course, it's one wonderful tool that allows us to make the internet more accessible and more useful, because geolocation allows you to figure out where people are and tailor the content on the internet based on where they are, right? So many of you probably enjoy the fact that if you look up a Chinese restaurant and you sit right here, Google will show you Chinese restaurants that are in Haifa surroundings, right? Not every Chinese restaurant in the world based on alphabet or whatever. So that's very useful. Now, geolocation used to be based only on IP addresses. So Internet Protocol addresses, right, many of you probably know, are the sets of digits in the new version of the Internet Protocol addresses, IPv6. It's actually digits and letters that identify certain internet connection. So if you are at home, you have maybe cable internet provider, when you turn on your modem, right, you will get an IP Internet Protocol address. In the old days, geolocation relied only on IP addresses. Groups of IP addresses have been assigned to particular providers, geographical areas, so you could figure out from a list of IP addresses, literally, where an IP address would be located, approximately. Now, if you look at some current court decisions, what's very depressing that you can see judges still referring to that method as the only method of geolocation, proving that our judiciaries tend to be about 20 years behind. Because these days, of course, geolocation has many other input data that it can use and rely on. So GPS signals, radio signals, and other that you can have thanks to your mobile devices. So geolocation, right, helps you to determine a user physical location. It's actually more complicated than that because it actually identifies only the internet connection of the device, of a device, right? So it can tell you where the internet connected device is located, but it doesn't necessarily tell you that that's where the user is. And certainly in the age of Internet of Things, right, you might have devices that will be located very far from their users. So that's a big caveat. Also, you have to remember that some IP addresses, to the extent that some of the geolocation still relies only on IP addresses, are assigned dynamically. So many actually providers of internet connections, right, don't have enough IP addresses to assign to every individual user. And so they work with a pool of IP addresses that are assigned dynamically, right? So most of us, unless we ask our cable internet provider to give us a static IP address, you will end up with a dynamically assigned that will change each time you turn on or off your modem. The IPv4 is the old Internet Protocol address system. The IPv6 is the new one. The transition has been very slow, so for now, again, we live in a world where some IP addresses will be still assigned dynamically. Now, this is different from an identification of a user's device. The problem is you actually recognize the connection, right? But that's not necessarily the identification of the particular device. Right, so on my IP address at home, right, it can be my computer that's connected to the IP address, it might be my nephew, right, and of course if any pirated movies are downloaded in our household, it will be my nephew, right, and not me. So that's something different. MAC addresses are the numbers that are on your letters that are on your computer or mobile phones that can be used to identify a particular device. There are also other mechanisms, so there is, for instance, computer fingerprinting. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has a very neat tool. I recommend all of you to run your devices through that tool that shows you that we have actually a lot of settings on our devices that are, the combination of the settings is quite unique. So if you run it through the tool that the Electronic Frontier Foundation offers, you can actually see one of how many devices your computer is, and again, combined with other information, you can get pretty close to identifying the device. All of this is, of course, still different from attribution to a particular user. Because even if it's my internet connection, even if you can show it's my laptop, right, it still doesn't have to be me physically who typed on that particular laptop. So when we talk about geolocation, right, remember that we are talking about the first category, which is only locating the particular connection to the internet, may be the device, right? But it's certainly not an attribution to a particular user. So how is geoblocking different from geolocation? So geoblocking has to first rely on geolocation. So first of all, you have to have the information about where the user is probably located, where the internet connection actually is. And then the second step is geoblocking, which is you can have mechanisms that will ensure that a person who connects to or tries to retrieve content from a particular website from a certain geographical area will be blocked. So back to the BBC example, right? I'm trying to access the BBC show from outside the UK. I will get blocked. I cannot do anything about it. So in geolocation, right, when you think, for instance, about Google News, if you turn on Google News right now, you will probably get the Israeli version, right? But you will have a button somewhere that says, oh, you can switch to English, you can switch to whatever. However, if you are geoblocked, like in the case of the BBC program, BBC will not offer you a way around it, right? That's it. You are blocked, and you cannot do anything to access the content. Well, you can, but we will get to that later. So geoblocking has been adopted by private sector. It's of course used like any imposition of physical barrier for market partitioning. You can think of it in two ways, right? At the first level, market partitioning in terms of providing people information about goods and services. So you can decide, you know what, we don't want to sell to Israel because we don't want to deal with warranty and liability under Israeli law, right? And the other way you can think about it is actually delivery of content, right? So that might be Paramount Pictures saying to an Irish TV station, look, we will give you a license to show our film in Ireland, but nowhere else, right? So then it's not only about the provision of information about the content, but it's actually the actual delivery of the content. So security, of course, is very important. If you tried to bank in your bank, online bank from some, let's call it unusual countries or unusual areas, your bank from home might give you a message, well, we are sorry, but we really don't think this is a good idea. This might not be you. We don't provide services from this country. By the way, something that many US soldiers complained about, because when they're in Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever, they actually cannot do online banking from home. And another reason why private sector has used geoblocking quite heavily is compliance with territorially defined contractual obligations. So there might be situations, copyright licensing is one of them, where the provider gets a territorially limited license, right? They get license only for Ireland, only for Germany. And in some of these licenses, the licensor actually imposes an obligation on the licensee to geoblock. And of course, those of you in the room who are lawyers, which are most of you, or future lawyers, right, realize that there will be a problem always with, of course, setting the particular technological standards to make sure that geoblocking complies with what the licensor actually envisions. Geoblocking has also been used for regulation and the enforcement of laws. It's not very known, but there are actually governmental agencies and some courts that do view geoblocking as a legitimate and sometimes really the only way to territorially limit content on the internet. So I was somewhat surprised, given where I sit, that online gambling apparently is one of the places where regulatory agencies are very keen on seeing effective geoblocking being used, right? So that people, organizations, companies that are licensed to provide gambling services in certain territories, certain jurisdictions, only provide them there, nowhere else. The same for enforcement of laws, right? So I know that the students in the room have discussed the law in France and other places in Europe, the right to be forgotten, right? So you might know that at one point Google actually agreed to geoblock and to make sure that certain content that was delisted from Google would not be available in certain countries, whether it was on .google.fr or .google.us, com, or whatever. So circumvention of geolocation, geoblocking, since that seems to be a popular topic whenever, I just hope that there's no secondary liability attached to this, because I just heard from too many people, oh, I never heard of it until your talk. Okay, so circumvention of geoblocking. So there are technological tools that allow your IP address to appear as if you were located somewhere else. There are free of charge services that work like many free services work, maybe not very long, not always. And then there are paid services, right, where you can pay per month, per year, whatever, and actually use a virtual private network or other systems to alter your IP address. If you look at websites of these services, you will notice that they are very careful about promoting, advertising their business as privacy protection only. They are not crazy, and they do have lawyers, right? There were times a few years ago that some of them really actually advertised themselves as, oh, hey, you're outside the UK, you missed your BBC shows, come to our website, pay us $5 a year, and you can look like you're in the UK. Those types of websites, or at least the text disappeared, right, and now they all cast themselves as privacy protection-oriented services. Where you can tell the difference usually is whether they allow you to router your internet connection through a certain particular jurisdiction or not, right? So the pure privacy protection, I would say, services usually say, you know, click here, we will route you through some countries, and nobody will know where you are. I would say the ones that tell you, oh, and here's a list of countries, you can pick whether you will sit in the US, UK, Germany, you might wonder, right? So there are different types of these services. Now, remember that these newer technologies, of course, can geolocate you not only based on your IP address, but also GPS, radio signal, and so forth. There are ways to spoof everything, including GPS signals. There is an app for that. So you can actually download an app and have your phone showing a different GPS location, which can be surprisingly handy in some situations. And so again, these newer circumvention tools also ensure that you can actually circumvent geoblocking even when the geoblocking system is more sophisticated. So why would anybody bother to circumvent geoblocking? Well, certainly if you want to access some information that is inaccessible to you, right, you might want to use one of these circumvention tools. And of course, I'm being a little cynical about this because I'm an IP expert, and of course, protection of copyright I'm really worried about. But in fact, of course, there are many important and more important reasons for people to circumvent geoblocking. So we are talking about people who live under oppressive regimes and need to access information from outside their country. There are also instances, by the way, surprisingly, of the opposite problem, right? So these might be people who are outside of the country, but they need to appear as if they were in the country, maybe to share some information speech that should look as if they were located in the country. Of course, privacy protection is part of that. You might not want people to know where you are located. I joined the students here on a visit to a law firm on Tuesday, and you heard from one of the attorneys there who mentioned that if you can tell about a person, right, where the person is within like 4 times a day or something, you can pretty much say who the person is. So that's an example of this. Secure free speech, but also for a lot of different testing of networks and technologies. So what about this concept of territorialization of the internet? Well, as many of you know, originally the internet was sort of conceived, first of all, not as the internet, but as some kind of network that will not collapse under nuclear attack. But once it became the internet as we know it today, there was really no idea at the beginning that it would somehow correspond to individual jurisdictions, right? As a matter of fact, many people hoped that it would be this ideal free trade, free everything zone, where no laws of any particular country would apply, and we would have new laws that these internet communities would somehow generate and apply. And of course, Professor Geis wrote very nicely about how that all was really only an idea and fell apart. So it seems that users today expect no boundaries on the internet, right? So geoblocking, maybe thank God, is still not the default, right? It's something unusual that we encounter on the internet, and many of us get upset about because we don't expect it to happen. I argue that what we have seen since about mid-2000 is a gradual process of territorialization of the internet, meaning countries, jurisdictions, retrieving back their sovereignty in the jurisdictional space, even within the internet. So certainly geolocation and geoblocking technologies are aiding this process, but frankly, we are guilty as well, right? Because we love the fact that we have location-based services. We love the fact that we can use Uber and Lyft and whatever, and you turn on the phone and there's the map, and you're right there, it shows you where you are, right? We like the fact that we get, well, many of us like, apparently, that we get location-based advertising and all that. I just recently wrote a paper about the process of territorialization in the internet domain name system, right? So something that was once viewed as a great example of this borderless new legislation for the internet, right? We have ICANN, and we have one UDRP, and everybody's happy. Well, no, it's being heavily territorialized, even within the new top-level domain names. So I would say that geolocation and geoblocking fits within this trend of territorialization. Again, within the trend, you can see many components of it, and geolocation and geoblocking is only part of it. So, of course, this process has been propelled by a great portion by countries, governments, jurisdictions, who again wants to have their internet space, but also other factors have contributed to this story. So let's talk about mandatory versus voluntary geoblocking. Many of this will be quite apparent. So some geoblocking is mandated by law. Again, so far we have very little of that. Online gambling is one of the probably most prominent examples where agencies in the jurisdictions that do regulate online gambling do turn to geoblocking. It's very interesting because they actually have to certify companies that provide geoblocking. So they set certain technical standards for geoblocking, which is quite remarkable. Judicial recognition of offenses of geoblocking. Again, you don't see it very much. Judges are still somewhat behind this technology, but you can see in some instances that courts do look at geoblocking as a potential tool, the tool to distinguish territories, jurisdictions, and so forth. Some companies do actually use geoblocking because they just don't know what the law will be like, right? If you advise a client today on the GDPR in Europe, right, and you tell your client, look, you must not target European customers. You know what? If your client tells you, I don't really care whether my website is available in Europe, well, maybe you are just as well if you tell the client, well, why don't you just geoblock everybody who approaches you from Europe, because then you're absolutely safe, right? You can tell the court, I did everything I could not to target. Administrative agency reliance on geoblocking, again, the right to be forgotten is one of the examples. So, of course, this causes all sorts of problems because you might end up with content blocked in one country, courts ordering to block content worldwide when they should be only inaccessible from certain parts of the world. The Telewizja Polska case is quite sad. I can talk to you about it later if you are interested. That was a case about geoblocking that was recently decided. Now, voluntary geoblocking. So what will be voluntary? Well, those will be instances where companies decide to geoblock, although there's no necessity to do so, right? There's no law telling them you must geoblock. So for instance, right, you have a copyright owner who owns copyright to a work worldwide, let's say Paramount Pictures to a motion picture, but they decide to geoblock, right? They decide to give territorial limited licenses subject to geoblocking obligation. So what about the legality of geoblocking? So here in my paper, which I hope is the last paper on geoblocking ever, I divide the discussion between the legality of mandatory and of voluntary geoblocking. Why? Well, because I think that different really issues are associated with these two categories. So when you think about mandatory geoblocking, right, we are talking about a situation when the government, court, parliament, legislature, or an administrative agency orders somebody to geoblock, right? You have no choice as a company, as a private person, you are being told you must, that's the law. Well, there you can think about different options, right? So in some circumstances, such law order to geoblock could be in violation of the WTO rules, right? So WTO or other similar trade rules that require free flow of trade of goods, services across national borders could be violated by some law that would order to geoblock. Just as any other law that would tell you not to transfer the goods or services across the borders would be. Of course, with intellectual property, this is a little tricky because, as many of you know, trade agreements typically have a carve-out from free trade in goods for intellectual property protection. So that might be a little different. Within individual jurisdictions, right, like the European Union, we think of it as a jurisdiction, or within the US, right, you might have intra-country rules that again prevent the individual jurisdictions within the country to impose barriers on free trade. So in the US, for instance, the Commerce Clause would be an example of a law that prevents these types of limitations. By the way, dormant Commerce Clause in the US and the internet, very controversial, certainly because of the taxation of online sales, for instance, and we are still waiting for the US Supreme Court to decide on that. In the EU, right, the rules on digital portability is something that the European Commission came up with a few years ago, and just last year the EU adopted the new regulation. It's also called the Netflix regulation, free movement of Netflix. People who know a little bit about the background say it's actually the law, the regulation for the wife of the Estonian vice president of the European Commission. The background story is that allegedly she was very upset that she was not able to watch Estonian soap operas in Brussels. Who knows, but nice story anyway. And so the cross-border portability regulation says that services such as Netflix, if they sell their services in one EU country to their customer, if that customer temporarily goes to another EU country, Netflix or a similar service has to ensure the same service will be provided there. And by same service, they mean the same content. So instead of her going to Brussels and seeing the Belgian version of Netflix, she will go to Brussels and see the Estonian version of Netflix. You might wonder, what does it say about human nature that we want to travel to other countries and still watch our own soap operas? But that's what the Commission decided was apparently ideal. So that's the cross-border portability regulation. If you are interested in conflict of laws, issues of legislation entering into private contracts, it's a fascinating case study. Again, I can get back to it later. So what about voluntary geoblocking? Is there any law that prohibits copyright owners from voluntarily geoblocking, right? Is there anything that could stop them at all? So the cross-border portability regulation will be part of that. There is also an anti-geoblocking regulation that was adopted earlier this year in the European Union that was originally very broad and was very problematic, particularly for motion picture studios in Europe, in small markets that were afraid that they will not be able to do co-productions and finance their motion pictures. But in fact, in the legislative process, it turned out that geoblocking is actually useful, that there are many groups that are very interested in keeping geoblocking available. So the geoblocking that is being prohibited by the regulation at the end of the day will be interesting for us as consumers when we travel around Europe and try to rent a car or do whatever. But for copyright law purposes, it might not have as a great effect as many people hoped. Another tool that could help against voluntary geoblocking would be competition law, right, or antitrust law, where it's interesting in the European Union right now, they have a case against large US, mostly US-based motion picture studios, precisely because these studios enter into licensing agreements in which they impose geoblocking. So going back to the Irish example, right? Paramount Pictures saying we give Sky or whoever license, but only for Ireland, or maybe Ireland and the UK. And by the way, you, the network, have to geoblock everybody else. The European Commission said that that's similar to actually prohibiting passive sales under competition law, which is something that the European Union law doesn't allow. So the European Commission said, well, this is sort of equivalent to prohibition of passive sales. We don't think it's legal. What happened was two of the studios that are being investigated under this competition law rule caved in and said, okay, we will settle and actually agree not to impose geoblocking, which is very interesting because the European Commission interprets it today as a confirmation that their legal opinion is correct. Well, it was settled, so we don't know what's correct, right? But that's the outcome of this particular decision. So competition law can certainly help in some circumstances, but of course competition law will be really at play only if you have multiple players, right? So prohibition against passive sales will work if you have prohibition against passive sales. If you have the same company that owns the content and also delivers the content, and it will be that company that decides how to geoblock, competition law might not really help you as much. So the questions here are really fundamental, right? It is about legitimacy of limitations of access to information, right? Is every content really information to which everybody should have right to access? How far should copyright, for instance, protection go? And also the legitimacy of market partitioning, which is a very fundamental question. And in my paper, I have some examples from recent decisions of the US Supreme Court that suggest that the society and certainly the justices might be changing their views on market partitioning, right? Even in the European Union, the Court of Justice of the European Union seems like views market partitioning as not something automatic, right? They are saying, look, copyright owners should have adequate remuneration, but not necessarily maximum remuneration. So market partitioning is not something that must exist, might not actually be desirable at all. So, opposition to geoblocking. There are many reasons why people oppose geoblocking. They say it's contrary to the original architecture of the Earth. It's imperfect. Well, yes, it is. There is some spillover, and we have to admit that the spillover is more than negligible. And apparently after I'm giving these lectures, it's absolutely more than negligible because everybody now circumvents. But also a problem is that there is really an uncertainty about the legality of the circumvention. We don't really know, right? In my earlier paper in 2012, I go through different laws that might apply and might make some cases of circumvention illegal, but we don't really know. There was actually a case in New Zealand, not surprisingly. In New Zealand, they have also great problems with geoblocking because they get content from outside New Zealand, right, in English, but it's being geoblocked. Global Mode was active in New Zealand. They were sued by major networks and content providers. Unfortunately, the case settled. So we don't know what the result would have been there. Also, implementation costs are quite high, right? So the question, should we impose geoblocking on everybody for whatever reason? Well, it's not without a cost, so that's something to consider. And of course, there is a very important issue, which is it has impact on free speech, right? If you prohibit any spillover, it might be actually very problematic. My objection to the objections is that I believe that geoblocking is a technical tool, just like any technical tool. And if people object to geoblocking, it's usually not because they object to the technology, but because they object to some underlying reasons for which geoblocking is being used. So my point has always been, why don't we start addressing the reasons for which geoblocking is being used? Don't vilify geoblocking itself. There are some reasons why geoblocking is positive. I know it's a very hard sale. I agree with that, but you have to think about from the global perspective whether the availability of geoblocking is actually helping the volume of content that's being made available, right? So think of a local radio station. And in Europe, this is a very hot topic right now, right? You're a small radio station, you want to broadcast online. If you are told you have to purchase a global license, you might not have your radio, right? You might be very happy that you can geoblock people who connect from Haifa. And you say, well, look, I would love to broadcast for the rest of Israel. I would love to broadcast for everybody in the world, but I cannot pay for the global license. So, do we want small independent radios, right, that can actually afford operating or not? You might say, well, we should have no copyright. Well, that would maybe be a solution too, but that's a different story. Geoblocking allows for content to be available where it is legal. That's important, and allows for territorial limited lower priced licensing. Whether market partitioning is good or bad, I don't want to enter the debate here, but certainly if you believe that market partitioning by definition might be good in some circumstances, because maybe price differentiation in some circumstances is useful, that would also be a reason for geoblocking. Also, the fact is that countries will very unlikely agree on every single law we have. Think of online gambling, think of child pornography, think of other things. There will be some areas of law where countries will never agree. And it will be useful to be able to geoblock the content and say, okay, this will only be available in this country where we know it's legal. So again, online gambling and other sensitive areas of regulation will provoke countries' strong policy stances for which geoblocking on the internet offers actually a workable modus vivendi. So that was all from me. I will make these slides available through the center because I put on all these links to whatever I happen to write about geoblocking, and that will actually answer your questions. If you want to see my presentation on the circumvention of geoblocking, apparently it's on YouTube. And the best presentation I gave on the topic was at DEF CON in Las Vegas at the big computer hacker conference. And it was amazing because it was a room of, 500, 300, 2,000 people? Okay, so 2,000 people. And I think there were 4 lawyers in the audience, and one of them was my husband. And that was a great talk, so that would be on. Thank you very much.
So now we'll hear from Professor Guy. Yes, please. 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, and thanks for that paper. I hope it's not the last one, because I like geoblocking, and I think it's good. It's nice to see some familiar faces here of students I've taught either this year or in prior years. To me, this is an issue that I've been thinking about for a long time and is super interesting. I really, want to make just a couple of points. The first, I think, from a technology perspective, is that this issue has actually been with us for a very long time, and I think in some ways it even predates the time frame that gets established in the paper in terms of kind of the certainty level with connecting it with wireless in the mid-2000s. The best known by far internet case from a jurisdictional perspective that people always come back to is a case known as the Yahoo France case. That a lot of people will be familiar with. It goes back to 2000 when Yahoo made available on their website Nazi memorabilia. The Silicon Valley ethos at the time was one that, why did it really matter that France's law might prohibit the availability or distribution or even display of this kind of content? This was a free speech, freedom of expression issue in the United States. And one of the ways that the French court sought to grapple with that question was to actually convene a panel of experts to identify how effective was geo-identification, if not geo-blocking? How effectively could you identify where users were coming from? One of the members of that panel was Vint Cerf. For students in our class right now, they're nodding their head because we talked about Vint Cerf back in Ottawa a week ago. And that panel found, and we're talking about the year 2000 at that point in time, that panel found that that Yahoo could identify where users were located with about 75% accuracy, about 75% of the time, which isn't nearly as good as it is today. But the reason for that is that the roughly 1/4 that they couldn't identify were quite literally users of AOL. And so AOL was displaying all of their users, America Online, for those that don't recall AOL. It's like the phone booth from earlier in the class. AOL was this company that was very, very popular, and they were routing all their traffic through Richmond, Virginia, and so that was the one place where it was very difficult. But otherwise, the capability of identifying where users were located has been there for a long time. In fact, the ability to identify where people were located right down to very precise geographic places also predates kind of the ubiquity of wireless that we find today. I served on the advisory board of a company called Quova, which was one of the early entrants in the geo-identifying space. Their goal was to be able to map the internet geographically and then sell that to companies. Or, as it turns out, sell to other people as well. And so I was on their board before them in the 2000s, and they had a client, a government client, that was involved in wars in the Middle East that wanted Iraq geo-identified right down to the street corner. And so they were able to do that. And so the use of this technology isn't just about Netflix. Sometimes it serves assortment of other purposes. Just as an aside, you referenced this difference between different kinds of VPN services and sort of sought to distinguish between whether or not they give you a menu of options of where it appears you come from. I actually don't think that's the differentiating factor. The differentiating factor is the difference between what's known as DNS redirection or actually providing a true virtual private network. So where you are doing nothing more than redirecting your domain name as an effort to disguise where you're coming from, that has fewer privacy enhancing attributes, shall we say. But if you're offering up a true virtual private network in the sense that your connectivity is private, you can also be offering up some of those DNS redirection services. So you can have both the benefits of a private communication and also the fact that you might be coming from somewhere else. So that's actually, I think, the trick to distinguish between the two. What I really wanted to talk about, though, is not so much the technology, but talk a bit about Netflix. And I'm glad that you raised Netflix, because Netflix has been driving this issue for some time now. Netflix had the capability of identifying where users were located for a very long time. Of course, they co-locate their servers directly with internet service providers as a means to reduce their bandwidth costs. So they will actually put everything directly within the ISPs that you use. They know where you're located. What they also knew for some of the early countries that they moved into was that their library in those local countries sucked as comparison to the libraries that were available in the United States. That's true in Canada, it was true in Australia, it was true in a number of jurisdictions. And so what they knew was that large numbers of their users were actually adopting VPN style services, sometimes DNS redirection services, to try to trick Netflix to allow them to access the US library of content rather than their local library of content. Now, of course, Netflix had very often not licensed that content for, let's say, Canada or Australia or another jurisdiction. And the truth is that everybody, at least in the early days, was willing to kind of look away and say this was okay. Canada, Australia, and a few other countries that Netflix operated in weren't viewed as significant enough, much to Canada's chagrin, I suppose, so that Netflix really only fundamentally cared about the United States, and if this was driving some adoption, it wasn't really the end of the world. From the perspective of the large players who might be licensing content, it was just spare change in a sense. It really didn't matter all that much to them, and so Netflix said that they would try to stop people from accessing, but by and large they didn't. All of that changed when Netflix said they were now going to roll out to about 100 countries around the world. And once they did that, suddenly now you had rights holders who said, hold on a second, we might have been okay with people being able to access this content in a couple of jurisdictions outside of where we've actually licensed. But to sell you, in effect, a US license that turns into a global license in the way that you are using this is an entirely different story. And so suddenly, almost overnight, Netflix suddenly did what it was always capable of doing, which was trying to identify users and on that basis starting to block them. But here's where things get problematic. Because what Netflix decided to do was not engage in geo-blocking, at least not the way I would think of it. What they really decided to do was VPN block. And so what they said was, we don't even need to necessarily get into the question of where you are coming from. All we need to do is to decide if you are using a VPN, we'll block you. And so that even people who are located locally would sometimes find themselves, if they were choosing to access Netflix through a VPN, would find themselves blocked. They were entitled to access the content that way, they'd still get blocked. Now, of course, you might say, well, why does that matter? And I think Marketa's presentation highlights some of the reasons why it does matter. You might not want your provider or Netflix to know who you are. You might want some amount of privacy in terms of the ability to watch what you want to watch, and might use the VPN so that your service provider isn't able to access that information. They often offer up competing services. Their ability to know that you're actually accessing Netflix and potentially even know more about that is something that you might want to keep private. There was also, and you had it in the bullet point, but it's worth expanding upon, there was a real network issue here too. Because net neutrality, which has emerged as a significant issue for a lot of players, came up in part through some of the Netflix-related issues too, because there were allegations that certain ISPs were slowing down Netflix-related traffic. Now, they might have obvious competitive incentives for doing so, because they're offering up, in some instances, competing services. It might be video on demand, it might be streaming services. If the Netflix service runs slower, you might say, you know what, I'm going to give one of these other services a try. Indeed, the number of people tested it with some of these providers and found when they accessed Netflix using a VPN, as opposed to accessing it in the open, the speeds of Netflix was far better. So there were real reasons that people might want to use Netflix and use a VPN at the same time. But Netflix's decision wasn't to, as I say, to geo-block. Instead, it was to VPN block. That to me highlights a significant problem, because there is real value in using some of these VPN services. And in fact, when you get large players doing this, it stops what is otherwise meritorious activity. In fact, we also saw this happen with Google just 2 weeks ago. Google stopped a practice, it's literally, I think, 2 weeks ago, stopped a practice known as domain fronting, which they allowed some of their apps to appear as if it was coming from google.com, and it was widely used by some app developers to circumvent restrictions in certain countries that seek to restrict access to certain countries. In a sense, Google acting like a VPN. And Google stopped offering up that service too. The fact that we were so dependent upon that, or certain players were so dependent on that, suddenly meant that app developers' ability to circumvent some of the censorship restrictions was also lost at the same time. Now, the sad part of all of this, in my view, is that there were and there remain other options. But the emphasis on geo-blocking and the ability in some instances to be very, very effective is what's driven some of this. So for example, Netflix could have satisfied the Estonian Prime Minister's wife, not by using geo-blocking, but simply by using credit card and payment data. And so you could, for example, have these providers say, we are going to make accessible content based on your billing address, and credit cards are often used as an effective proxy for where you might be located. Now, of course, that might mean that there will be instances where you can be in Brussels and access content that you are not otherwise strictly licensed, but that's a small amount of the overall process. For the most part, people will have localized payment systems, and there are ways to defeat it, I recognize, but for the vast majority of people, it's not going to be that big a deal to be able to use that as a more effective proxy. But what we've seen emerge is, because the tech has become so effective, demands from the IP community is you've got to use the most effective system being geo-blocking, which has meant that in the process, we've lost some of the real benefits that accrue. And where Netflix goes, I would suggest we will see many others go as well. But that kind of emergence is perhaps fodder for another.
Thank you very much. move to our first student respondent, Shai. You have a presentation. Okay, Shai, please set up. While we set up, there's so much to discuss. I'll quickly note for Marketa, just on a technical level, that in the paper you talk about places where you have mandatory geo-blocking. So it's worthwhile mentioning that Israel has recently joined this world of countries that have mandatory geo-blocking in a very recent amendment to their telecommunications law, to the broadcasting law. So this is Article 13C(a)(6). And this is a law that talks about the fact, are you shy? Run out of material. Okay. This is a specific law. Someone's talking on top of me. Not a good idea. So this is a specific law that requires all Israeli broadcasts to provide their content online. And given the complexity of what this requires, especially a possible contrast with trips, the law requires that the entity that does so will, and I'll translate from Hebrew, use sufficient and advanced measures which are used to block or avoid the distribution of the broadcasts outside of Israel. Okay, I'm sorry, it isn't 6, number 5, okay? And the regulation goes on and addresses it, so it's very interesting. And there's a whole history here, so I wasn't aware of the fact that Israel was a legal innovator here. But now I understand that we had a lecture about Startup Nation here, so there's a Startup Nation in this law, which I think is somewhat problematic, but maybe I'll talk more about that later. Okay, Shai, are we okay?
I think so.
Need more jokes now?
No.
Don't worry
No.
about
No.
the time.
Sorry about that. So,
Yes, please, I was the warm-up for Shai, please.
good evening. My name is Shai Pnini.
8 minutes, yes?
Not 10. And I will give my short review and personal insights about geo-blocking and legitimate trade, the article by Marketa Trimble. Borders. In the real world, governments use physical borders and checkpoints in order to restrict and control international trade. And other things, but also this. Rules and regulation and local tax authorities enable the country to enforce power over commercial and international actors in order to ensure compliance to domestic law. My first time using it, sorry. The global village concept. In 1962, Marshall McLuhan, author of the Gutenberg Galaxy, popularized the term global village as a concept of a world entering the fourth age, the electronic age, when people everywhere would be able to find and experience the same information through technological tools without borders or limitations. The World Wide Web. With the exponential global growth of the internet in the early 1990s, seemed that the web was fulfilling McLuhan's visions as a borderless world in which information is free from government intervention or other third-party interference. Over the years, the internet and digital products became huge economical markets which had an enormous effect on traditional commercial markets, especially the music and movie industry that during those years tried to restrict the flow of information in order to protect economical interests, and the territorialization trend of the internet has started. What I'm trying to say here, that the industry started the geo-blocking from commercial reasons. Geolocation. As described in the article, geolocation is a tool for the internet territorialization that reveals the user's location based on his internet-connected device, and mainly data from his IP address, GPS, and Wi-Fi signals, without any active permission from the end user, and in many times without his acknowledgement. Geoblocking. In a few words, which I understand, geoblocking could be defined by restricting and controlling the content or information available and viewed by the users based on his or her location. The early meaningful attempts for geoblocking. In the article, it says that in the year approximately 2000, geoblocking started in the internet, but a few years before that, they had the DVD regional coding. In the late 1990s, regional coding DVDs divides the world into six regions. DVDs and players in each region are uniquely encoded. In order for a DVD to play properly, a match is required between the code of the player and the one of the DVD itself. Europeans returning from a visit to the United States would find the American DVD purchased by them useless with their devices at home unless they had bought an American DVD player as well. In the early years of the new millennium, a technological breakthrough called the multi-zone DVD abolished geoblocking by regional codes. This, in my opinion, is the second meaningful attempt, and the first meaningful attempt was market partitioning